there was a comment about how more privileged people weren't participating because they have more to lose. I think that's a really, really interesting comment, and it's something that I read about and I've been thinking about, because this isn't the first form of rebellion or resistance that Britain has seen over the past year. Since coalition has come in, there have been days of actions, there's been protests, there's been occupations, and like nobody really seems to be referring to those now. And like overall, millions and millions of young people and academics and teachers and public service workers were involved in these actions, and yet there are a clear sign of discontent, but those actions are somehow seen more civil, and I think that's the problem. But what that shows, I think, is that the extent to which the actions of the government are now affecting people, that millions of people are willing to go on a protest because they are angry, they are upset, but they're also, some of them have something to lose, so they don't want to get in any trouble. But clearly, there is still a problem within the system. But now, I think for a lot of people, it's got to the stage where they have absolutely nothing to lose, and it's gotten so bad that protesting clearly isn't working. Fine, it's getting a couple of headlines, it's getting news reports talking about it, but actually it's having very, very little impact. So things have got so bad that people have no alternative.
I think it's an extension of that. I mean, you do see these alternative, or these forms of protests, like demonstrating for student fees and the cuts and March for the Alternative. But at the same time, what signals does that send out in society for young people? Because what has actually changed from these protests? So, I mean, what outlets do young people have to have their voices heard? I mean, do they talk to their MP? Do they, report police brutality to the brutal police? It's like, and then the positive forces that we might have, such as good schooling and youth facilities, are in their decline. So it's almost as if there is no alternative.
Some people spoke about that explicitly. People that I've read their voices reported on, not on the mainstream, but in other places, saying exactly that they saw it as a form of political protest because other channels aren't working. I'm not saying everyone sees it that way, but some people do. On that point, Kadish, I think it might be opportune for you now to share with us your poem. As I said at the start, Shake is an arts and politics project. Everybody here on the panel, except for me, writes poems. So Kadish is going to share with us her poem about the cats. As you wish.
Okay, so this poem's called Cuts, self-explanatory. Sorry? Oh, you want to start? Okay. Okay. Yeah, I wrote this for my final year in creative writing, and I got a first for it, which I'm proud of. It's sort of it's for Nick Play. Yeah. Okay. His cuts. Sliced islands around the feet of the poor and kingdoms around the feet of the rich, and told us to walk free. Still in the womb, he axed at our umbilical cords, disconnected our resources to feed himself. There is a scalpel-tongued man who has been feeding from the gut of our futures. A savage and brute feeding from 1 million dead carcasses, from our dead dreams that we can't even afford to bury. So their limp bodies fill the streets. The stink of decay lingers for weeks, but still he eats, because raw meat when young is always the best cut. Tonight, he will carve a tomorrow from snapped ligaments and severed corpses. Tomorrow will be nothing human, but the banquet of a beastly government who turned on his men, because he'd rather feed from than feed them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. Right, we're going to have 2 more contributions from the panel, and then we're going to push it out to you for a broader general discussion, on which we will close after 1 more poem. So, Selena.
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on it a bit already, so it's been interesting to hear Rose's thoughts about it as well. But I just wanted to talk about language that was used in terms of race. And I think, no? Is that better?
I think standing is going to be the way, isn't it?
There isn't a mic, is there?
No, I don't think we've got it.
Okay. I just wanted to talk about language in terms of race, and Lola mentioned it as well about how it kind of has become a bit of a race issue as well. And we've kind of had the buzzwords the words that we kind of heard in the media, and I just wanted to kind of extend that in terms of race, and particularly David Starkey and the whites are becoming, is it black? Yeah. And the commentary that's come out above that as well, which kind of touches on similar ground. For a start, I think the something of this nature, I think, incites fear, and from that fear, I think there was a major collective shift to the right, where kind of so-called liberals and lefties were saying, get the army out and suppress these feral beings by any means. And I think that creates a scapegoat culture of us and them. I think that was mentioned earlier on as well. And creating that us and them means that the other gets to abdicate responsibility of their position within the situation. And I think the obvious kind of issue is the dichotomy between black and white, and the notion that black would be associated with criminality and white would be maintained as something to be pure. Because I mean, the truth is that the riots have cut across an array of different people, young and old, I think, as we've mentioned, from different backgrounds. But again, this mentality of whites becoming black abdicates the white population of any kind of responsibility within the riots. So, in a sense, it's preserving this kind of white as pure stereotype, and then black as evil and as criminal. And it also kind of brings out the idea of a youth of black culture. I mean, it's a term that I can't define, and I think it's been used, you know, in a very one-dimensional way, and it's quite sweeping. And it's not something that I'm going to try and define. I think that's a very heavy term, but I think within the mainstream, the associations with black culture are very limiting. So they're assigned to that of hip-hop culture and gang culture and certain types of fashion and violence, to the extent where anything positive is all kind of attributed to white culture. I mean, David Starkey mentioned David Lammy and the fact that he's well-spoken and educated, so if you close your eyes, he sounds like a white person. Well, no, despite what you think of his political persuasions, he's educated and eloquent, and he's black, full stop. And I think that is part of the problem. Someone would also, with that kind of attitude, would call him a coconut, and it's that idea that, you know, there can't be anything positive in that sense. It has to be attributed somehow to white culture. So I think although David Starkey's comments were crass and ignorant, and that was blatant for all to see, I think the mainstream media echoes this in a more subtler way. So I think that particularly coming out of the riots is something to be aware of. And there was a quote that kind of reminded me of the situation I thought was really relevant. It was by, I can't remember her name, but she wrote Half a Yellow Sun. Yeah, she said that stereotypes aren't always untrue, but they're incomplete. So I think it's not only for, you know, black culture, but for youth culture as well. I think that's really relevant.
Thank you, Selina. And Sammy is going to give another contribution now on more general issues to do with being a young person in Britain today.
Okay, can you hear me?
Please.
Okay, I think there were a lot of young people participating in the riots, we can't deny that. But there's a lot of reasons why, and they seem to have gone unheard and just avoided. Now I think young people seem to always be targeted. I mean, they're given a little bit of concession because they're young, but then it gets taken away, and then they're helped when they're young, and then when they reach 18, everything's taken away from them, and they're not given any form of support, and you're legally an adult, whatever that means. But I think problems start lower down. The education system, I think, is quite frankly awful. And what happens is when you get to like the age of 18 or 19 and you're encouraged to go to university, often you're asked to consider what job you want to do and whether that degree will provide you with certain skills. You're not taught that education is an end in itself. You're not taught about personal development, about human fulfillment, about wanting to learn about things because knowledge is what we want to get. We're not taught about any of those things. We do English at school and we do creative writing, maybe one module out of 20 in your whole year, in your whole life, but you're not really given the opportunity to use those at any point later on while you're still at school. You're then taught, if you're fairly bright, that stay away from English language, stay away from journalism, go into law, do English literature, go into history, because those essentially are where the money lies. And I think now it's even worse because we have universities having to cut their courses. Universities are losing courses like philosophy, absolutely brilliant degree to study, and yet it's seen as a waste of time. We're losing media, design, journalism, the sort of things that people are really interested in and have specific skills to do. And it puts people in a really awful situation. So I remember when I was, because this is my second year, so 2 years ago when I was deciding to go to university, there were people that clearly shouldn't have been doing A-levels because they didn't want to write essays. They didn't want to do exams. They would rather be making stuff or fixing things or drawing, but they were taught that A-levels are the things to do. And they finished their A-levels with results that didn't reflect their ability, their talent, their creativity, and they ended up going to universities that they didn't really like, doing courses that they thought were right and are struggling. Now, above anything, that creates unhappiness, and that linked in with the way in which young people are taught to behave by the media, in particular girls. Girls are taught by the media to look a certain way, to dress a certain way. If I was to walk down the street not with an outfit that didn't match, with hair in a mess or whatever, it's frowned upon. If you're not a certain size, it's frowned upon. And it makes it really difficult because then people can't talk about these issues and they're really integral to who you are. Back to education. Because universities are cutting their places, competition is fierce. I think the summer that just went by probably saw the hardest UCAS process, I think, ever, because it was the last year in which people could get into university without having to pay £9,000 a year. So what you heard was people scrambling to get a place to do any sort of degree at any sort of university, not thinking about whether or not that was for them. Because the way that we're taught to believe is that if you don't have a degree, you're not going to get a job. If you're not going to get a job, you're not going to get food on the table, and you won't really be able to live. But that isn't fair. I honestly think that if you do what you enjoy, things will work out. If you're happy and you love your job and stuff, even if you're getting paid not very much, you will be happy, and that's more important. But young people now have had their EMA cut. Youth unemployment is ridiculously high. Transport is prices have gone up. In London, it's quite ridiculous because often people can't just walk to school because of where London is. So they need to get a bus or they need to get a train, and that's added expenses, and now they don't get EMA to cover it. Consumerism, I think, affects a child from a very young age. I read a report recently about how parents, even though it's evident to them that their children would rather play football with them or sit and talk to them, feel the need to buy them things. So if you're constantly being given things and you don't necessarily want them, it sort of, I don't know, it must create a lot of confusion. But also it makes you think that's the norm, and that actually puts strain on the family, on the parents. It makes them very worried, but really there's no need to do that. But that begins at a very young age, and obviously that carries on. And now this is, I think, we had a lot of this in the riots, which was about trying to get trainers and trying to get, like, I wasn't ever, because it wasn't, it's not available to everybody.
Thank you very much, Samira, as well. Zena, did you want to quickly comment on, I brought you at the wrong time, but do you want to quickly...
That's okay. Yeah, I wanted to just comment...
Stand up.
Yeah, okay. Comment on both of them, actually. I wanted to comment on the language issue. I think the reason for why David Starkey was able to continue with his rant, and he had a personal agenda. You notice he pulled a little thing out of his pocket, so it was pre-prepared. He wasn't there to listen. He came with, he wanted to make a statement, and that was it. And I think the reason why the BBC allowed him to continue to speak, I think for the language that continued on the BBC, the kind of the approach that was taken, is because there's a lack of a flexing of a particular muscle in terms of the language used around the issues of race in the media. I think it needs to be flexed a little bit more. I think just talking about race in the UK is, there's an issue around that in general. I think we have a lot of knee-jerk reactions, which is fine. You have to let the knee-jerk pass. And then we start to get into the depths of it, into the thick of actually really talking about what race is about. For example, when you start talking about the terminology black, there is no black land to define a definition of what blackness is. What you have is the African diaspora. When you think about the African diaspora, you think about the Caribbean islands. You think about those people who have travelled to different parts of the world, who have incorporated, who have been chameleon-like, and who've been adapted to suit a particular way that they can exist, function as people of African descent in that country. So I think the thinking about the African diaspora enables you to blow wide open the concept of what blackness actually is. You take into consideration culture, you take into consideration heritage, you take into consideration a whole migrant experience, for example. My mum is first generation, I'm first generation born in the UK, I'm from the Caribbean, so I have a migrant experience, a settler experience. My mum's from the Caribbean, so I have a settler experience, but that's not taken into consideration. What happens is you become black. And I think there's an issue there. I don't necessarily even appreciate the term black British because it actually totally eliminates the whole of your culture. So, and that also means that you do not have a language. If you're going to consider everybody to be black, then there's no language to discuss what blackness or Africanness or what the diaspora is about. It's not a muscle that's flexed or used in media language. I don't think it's used enough. So I think that's why David Starkey got away with quite so much. We can also start talking about whiteness. What is whiteness? And we start talking about the white diaspora. So we really have to start thinking about how we use language and how language can be just as constraining. So we have to start thinking about that. That's the first thing I wanted to say. Also, just talking about education very quickly. It's very interesting what you were saying, Sammy, about the types of courses that have been cut. Philosophy is a thinking module. I don't think education necessarily focuses on, again, thinking about a muscle, flexes a muscle to get people to think, because thinking means you have autonomy, it encourages autonomy, and that can become a problem. So particularly when you just want to be able to control people and get them to do what you want them to do. So those are the two comments that I wanted to make.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got 20 minutes left. We're going to close on another artistic contribution, so that gives us just over 15 minutes, which I know is a really, really short period of time. There are so many questions raised by the events and by what we've heard that it's difficult to come up with one catch-all. Our question, which you can take in any direction you want to, our question for now, since this was originally going to be the Radical Media Conference, is what is a radical response to the riots? Okay? A couple of things which I think might be interesting to touch upon in that, but you don't have to, are if there are positives that came out of them, and if whatever problems we think there are some particular solutions locally, nationally, that we may want to raise now. Again, although we haven't got much time, I think it would be a good idea if we had a minute for you to reflect with each other on what you think a radical response to the riots is, taking that question in any direction you want to, and then we'll get through as many people as we can. Okay? What do we want to say? What needs to be said that is useful, that we want to take away from here? And if you haven't contributed, stick your hands up and I'll try and identify people who haven't spoken so far. At the back, I don't think we've heard from you. Yeah.
I think a good radical response would be we sympathize so much with everything.
I can't hear.
Sorry. I think a good radical response would be to actually support and solidarize with the people who are facing very heavy charges after riots.
Good. Does anyone... Is anyone here involved in that activity? Because there are a number of people who've been doing that kind of thing.
Tottenham Defence Campaign has been doing quite a lot of work. The first thing we did was like immediately getting bus cards out to all of the local estates in the Tottenham area. So just going around knocking on people's doors, being like, there's going to be a lot of arrests soon, there's going to be a lot of raids soon, there's going to be a lot of stops soon. Here's some legal information, here's some decent sympathetic lawyers, that kind of stuff. We're also like, basically that's going to have to happen for quite a long time, because if they're going to try everyone they're arrested, they're going to be doing trials like the next 3 years. And basically also going down to courthouses as well, because obviously duty solicitors are like, they get like about an hour's sleep every week or something now. So it's also just going to people being like, look, there are other sympathetic lawyers out there who want to support your case. We might be like better than duty solicitors or more sympathetic than duty solicitors. And that's kind of the immediate, that's what we have to do in the immediate future. And that's basically all we're able to do so far. But I've got like a Facebook group and a website and stuff like that.
Yeah, because that was like the deal after, because I think I've got a lot of people that couldn't do the whole
So can you repeat the name of the organisation?
It's just a Tottenham Defence Campaign, but there's a website, there's a Facebook group, the usual stuff.
I was wondering whether, I don't know, I'm from Birmingham, whether something similar would happen in Birmingham. Set it up.
This would be referred to as political prisoners, and what I've heard about them is that they're mock trials. They're not like taking anything as show trials. Show trials.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, just following on from that, I think there's other things around deaths in custody, and there's the United Friends and Family demonstrations around the high proportion of people dying in custody. There's a vigil on the anniversary of the death of Jimmy Mabenga on Friday. And there's also underlying issues in terms of the criminal justice system and young people that people are fighting around. The whole issue of stop and search. There's Stopwatch who are doing work on that. And there's a group called Joint Enterprise Not Guilty by Association that are actually working around the high numbers of young people who are in prison for a murder they didn't commit because they're mopped up when something happens.
Thank you very much.
I think following on from what you're saying there, I think it's important to report on the danger of the knee-jerk response and the aftermath of the sort of authoritarian response that we get there. But in general, it's important to humanize the situation, treat these people as real humans with real grievances, put much more in terms of interviews and trying to find out where they're coming from. I think that's humanization of the problem is the most important thing.
In Lewisham, shortly after the riots happened, we had quite a good campaign, protest organised by all the anti-locals or anti-vax groups, which was blame the government, not our kids. And we got quite a lot of support, putting all in the paper and everything. And I just think that it's really important now to try and link up all these campaigns, because it is all linked to the cuts that are happening, with the EMA, the student fees, to build, try and really build a massive around that.
I'm from Peckham. I used to live in Brixton. 30 years as a journalist, on television and the press. You might have seen me on TV challenging Boris Johnson over Mark Duggan when he was doing this walkabout in Clapham Junction. It was a photo opportunity for him. He didn't really want to meet the people. It was the sweeper-uppers. Did you see that? The media had an agenda. And so what I would say is that I've broken free. I'm a rebel now. That's why I'm at this conference. And I'm on Britain's first citizen journalism website, thelatest.com. If you forget that, just put it in Google, you'll find us. We brought down Boris Johnson's chief political advisor. Do you remember when he said black people can go back home if they don't like it here?
Yeah.
Or we took him out of his job. So we're talking solutions now. We've got a conference coming up at the LCC in November, media and, in quotes, the riots. But don't expect the leopard to change its spots. The media won't report this fairly because look at who are in the media. White middle-class men mainly. They don't live in those communities. They have no sympathy for those communities. Their bosses don't. And they're reactive. They don't put things in context. That's not what they're there for. They report the burning. They talk to the so-called victims of the burnings. They're not interested in talking to the youth. They think their cameras are going to get stolen, they're going to get beaten up, probably with good reason, because of all the shit coverage they've been given the communities for years and years, and they would get a thrashing. So I think we need to think now about our own ways of communicating and disseminating news. That's why Facebook's so great, Twitter. You talked on the platform about not going to Sky or the BBC as your primary source of news, because it's tainted, it's polluted. And so I'm really optimistic. We need to break free, even if it's just a blog on Blogspot. You think only 100 people might read it, but if it's everybody in the country, that's millions of people looking at our news rather than theirs.
I missed the beginning of the conference, so I don't know what exactly we spoke about of the talk, but I'm Greek, so for me it was, come on, fair enough. I was waiting for the words forever. What the fuck, but then we had some issues a year and something ago, when there was everything about the Gaza, all the marches, all the people arrested. We tried to get people together to see what happened, who got arrested, why, and there was nothing, like what you were saying before. There's no network because the riots, they bring people together that have certain issues, like they break their consent, basically, with the system. And then that breaks off. Because if we can get all the people together and create networks of disseminating information, finding who needs help, benefits, like we can make big benefits, not in Tottenham or Hackney, but like big collective benefits to collect money for these people and kind of get together. I think I would agree with that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah.
A couple of quick points. I'm a former corporate journalist, 5 years out, thinking about how to bring what I learned there, or unlearned now, into radical media. One specific thing is what Adam was talking about in Tottenham Defence Campaign. I think there are tons of media makers here. I think you should find some. And your defence of people, and I think some reports on your work, if you can do it, obviously you don't want to put people on the net, they don't want to be on it, but explain what you're doing, so that what's happening in Tottenham is seen elsewhere around the country, so radical media displaying that very specifically, I think would be really useful.
Yeah, sorry, just to come back to that. I co-edit C-Spy magazine, so I write for C-Spy magazine all about what we do.
But video as well, and you know, short stuff, and talk to the people on TV and people about that. They're really excellent. The second thing is to pick up on the second last and the last speaker's remarks about philosophy. Philosophy is like sort of, we so don't talk about philosophy, and we really should, because that's where democracy is talked about. That's where they defined it, and the ancient Greeks of 2,500 years ago, they understood so much more about participatory democracy versus the joke democracies that we live in. No, I know that. I know that. It's a good point, but you mustn't let that fog what the structures were. They were in the context of 2,500 years ago.
But self-organization exists now. It's a very contemporary context, so we can use that.
Yeah, but at a national, at a city-state level, there was rotational office. There was very, very few elected offices. The Greeks understood the corruption of elections. It's the beautiful, it's the well-educated, it's the rich who get elected. So you don't have elected offices. You have participatory structures. You have rotational office.
Where did the Greeks get it from?
The Greeks sort of made it up.
They made it up, did they? Did they make it up?
No, but yeah, they got it. I can't get into the conversation. I'm saying these are conversations we should be having. They're really important. It's about governance, and it's totally related to rights.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, I just want to say that actually you guys are an example of exactly, how your voice isn't being heard in the media, and you are, you're excellent advocates, and, what I think needs to happen more is that youth media is massive, Jamal Edwards and SBTV, young people making media is going to, it's going to just crash all media. Eventually, in a couple of years' time, Sky TV and BBC won't be happening anyway. So what I would love to happen is that there's a network of youth media. I've been trying to do that. Actually, Slade knows that we held a youth-led media summit 2 years ago, and trying to get more relationships between youth media and mainstream media, because it's a start.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I was wondering if it would be worthwhile people reaching out to, say, one or two affluent friends from affluent areas and encouraging them to write a letter. I'm a business owner, I'm an entrepreneur, whatever, property owner, and I care about this issue. Write to the BBC, write to mainstream media outlets. Because if it's people without that kind of background, then maybe it can just be dismissed as poor people complaining about their lot. It's just an idea right now.
But having said that, I'm from a residential background, I never have my MP do anything about anything I've wrote. I get a nice letter back, which is all kind of very nice, but they don't listen to that either, I suppose.
I'm just going to make a suggestion that because a lot of people are talking about things that could happen from here on, that I don't think there's anything happening in this room right after this. So if people want to stay in here to do any networking, that might be a good idea. People who are involved in defence campaigning or want to make links with radical media, and the idea that you had about a youth media network, maybe we can make this a space for a relatively short networking session until you get kicked out, basically.
There's also a contact sheet which is being passed around as Martin's run, so before you go, do give us your details, because we have a mailing list and link people that way as well.
That too, absolutely. Okay, we've got time for about 3 more points. Sorry, you at the back, yeah.
I'd like to see something that would make governance and corporations wake up a little bit. There's an African proverb that kind of sums it up for me. Something like, the young people of a village, in a village are not initiated. They'll burn it down just to feel its warmth.
That's actually something that PARCO have put on their literature, and PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition of Europe, is a group that Sheikh is working with. It's an event in Leeds, which I'll just give a quick plug for. If anyone's in the area, 29th of October, we'll be taking this discussion further. We'll be putting Britain on trial. So it's linking up groups in Leeds University, PARCO, and Sheikh, obviously, us, and so we're going to be doing a full conference on these issues up there.
Where at?
It's at the Carriage Works Theatre. It's 29th.
Yeah.
Sorry?
In Leeds.
In Leeds, yeah. Carriage Works Theatre.
Yeah. Okay, so a couple more, yeah.
Just really, really quickly.
Okay,
Sorry.
I had the guy behind you in mind, but go on, if it's quick.
Oh, that's fine.
All right, okay.
Well, I think a radical response would be to have loads of street parties, because London is quite a fascinating city. And what's really interesting is that we all exist side by side, parallel. I read a lot of interesting analysis about the riots and how you'd have youth basically fighting next to some guys who are in a restaurant having a nice kind of bougie meal. So I reckon maybe more street parties where people actually come out and go, I live next to you, I see you every day, but I'm actually going to talk to you. And it's the exact opposite of riot. It's actually getting people together and saying, let's go.
Is that street party related to the royal family or just...
Celebrate the street, whatever.
1, 2, 3.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just following that up, I think that the alternative entertainment industry has got a lot to speak for actually about creating radical change and about awareness, you know, and I think a lot of young people that aren't politically engaged or affected by the cuts are just choosing to be quite, you know, subdued about everything. I think that speaks for a lot of people. It's easier to just get on with their lives, you know, so if you can engage people in a non-abrasive way, but has got a platform for political discussion and alternative means, you know, I think that's quite important and, yeah.
Thank you.
Entertainment.
So just 2 more, sorry. People have been waiting for a long time.
Yeah, I like the fact that we pointed out talk to the youth, but I believe it's also important that we talk to the wider spectrum of participants during the ride. I myself from New Cross actually grew up a bit rough. I have quite a few friends who were involved in the riots at the time and who gave me their perspective of why they did it and how they got involved. So it's not just talking to the youth, it's talking to maybe single mums, middle-aged men, almost middle-aged men who got involved. Why did they go out and commit these acts? Something my friend pointed out, he went, oh, well, you're from our background, but how comes you're studying law now? It's good to look back at the history, what actually led on to these riots, what caused these. I myself, I was getting searched quite regularly, almost on a weekly basis, on the clothes I was wearing. I used to wear the hoods, slaggy bottoms and stuff like that, hanging around with my mates. And I kind of went into law to actually so I can advise my mates on the stop and search, because they didn't even exist. We used to get searched by the police and no search warrant. We weren't given the search tickets. We just said, have you got anything on you? You shouldn't have. That's it basically. Yeah. And we used to get bullied basically by the police, and the riots kind of was our payback because the police weren't there. So it's good to look back at the history, what's caused this, what's built this cause up, this frustration. So it'd be nice to get separate blogs from these people.
Great. Let's check it out. No, they're not in the carnival. We're not in the carnival that day. Thank you for that, Logan. It came on in August. We went to London Carnival. As soon as we got off the bus, get to the wall. Everyone's on the wall now, yeah. Police come, search us, whatnot. Me personally, I really could stop and search. I call it child molestation because the way they used to grope me is different. Oh my gosh. And then I was one of them when people were coming with their cameras and whatnot, and it's embarrassing. They're just standing there, and you've got 13 people with their phones out, and you even got this guy with actual big cameras watching us. It's just embarrassing. And then it wasn't even 5 minutes later before we got to the carnival, he get stopped again. And these times we got the receipts, and they're saying, the receipts don't matter, you could have stored something there and came back and picked it up. And then, another half an hour, again we were stopped and searched. They said that, something's just happening, so now we're checking again. And then, I thought, okay, maybe 3 times, that's a record for me, so I thought maybe that's going to end, isn't it? Was I mistaken? On the way out now, yeah, again, you guys get to the wall. I was thinking, there was no wall to get to. So then they stopped and searching us at random places and whatnot. Obviously you get angry and whatnot. You didn't even know why you was getting stopped and searched. Not no carnival's like a street party, you know what I mean? You come to celebrate West Caribbean culture, you come to celebrate, let everybody know what we're here and whatnot. And then you're just getting violated all the time with the police. It's just angry, The first time I was stopped and searched, I was 12. And then I had £100 a week. I went to go West End the next day, and then they said, where'd you get the money from? And I said, my mum gave it to me for shopping. And they proper harassed me and put me in the van and whatnot. try to tell me I may be drug dealing and whatnot, to call my mum up, what my mum did in the night, you know, just to say, oh, did you give us some £100 and whatnot. And just, you know, you got this hate that's building up. And obviously this was at our time, the police were gone. We're just going to go about in the streets and whatnot. And the thing is, what I noticed that the police were in that area, people can say the police weren't there. I actually watched police actually watch us walk past, and the people were like smashing windows and the police were just standing there. I don't know if it was no orders or whatnot. I don't know if it was calculated, but the police were just standing there. I see buses, in fact, they burnt the ones in one bus, and people just watching. I was thinking, my gosh, what are the police doing? They're like really and truly, are they instigating it, or are they actually trying to stop it? I don't know what they're doing. Now, obviously, I do think there's an agenda behind all this, because there's no way that our Prime Minister and our Mayor were both on holiday. The police were about, the police weren't doing nothing inside. I don't know if it was like some like political campaign for them to use, you know, try to get re-elected. I don't know if they get re-elected, but I don't know what's happening.
Really quick, just on that. If you really hear what that Rotimi is saying now, you're 18 now, right?
Sorry, can you?
Yeah. If you listen to what Rotimi's just explained his experience there, he's saying his experience is from 12 years old. Now, I saw something on very proud, so quick. I was watching a news clip very quickly when the Tottenham, because I was there in Tottenham and I saw everything kick off. I even spoke to Mark Duggan's missus. I saw her as I was walking to going to a friend's birthday party, and I bumped into her and said, what's going on? And she explained to me what happened. But I saw a news clip on TV, and there was one point where this young boy was trying to kick in a wall. He couldn't kick in a glass wall, in Ladbrokes or something. Trying to kick it in, couldn't get it in, so he was using his bare fist on this piece of glass, right? I just thought, that's what we need to deal with. We need to deal with this anger. And if we don't start addressing where that anger comes from, it's just going to happen again and again and again and again and again. And the whole thing with the police standing by, you only had to see what happened when the student riots. They left that police van in the middle of the.
It was an old police van, it wasn't.
Yeah, it's a complete setup. It's a complete setup. So it's a setup for a media frenzy. Every single politician needs a war. If they have a war that they can win, then it's great for their portfolio. So if you think about this as a civil unrest, it's almost like a civil war, and that's on Cameron's and Craig's flipping portfolios.
There's one person who's been waiting very patiently, and I've told him he can speak, so make your contribution is the last one.
I think it's really interesting to draw some parallels with other phenomena, like the growing Islamophobia and the discrimination against the Roma all over Europe. This culture of scapegoating is really worrying, and I think a response to that could be to promote critical thinking in schools, teach more philosophy, try to make the children understand things rather than just Google them. So that's what I think.